Yeah, so I think one of the reason today is, for the higher prices is because it's not open knowledge per se, right? It is not open knowledge from a personal perspective. I don't think knowledge should be monetized, is what I would say. So it's like software. Can you have the software from a Windows perspective or from an Apple perspective? And if you do have that, it's going to have a lot more people get into the picture. It's going to reduce the cost automatically.
I'm Ranjor, and this is Remake, a podcast about design, systems, and society. In each episode, I talk to someone who's trying to change our lives for the better in some meaningful way, whether through a new product, new venture, or a new way of looking at the world. And I try to understand how they came to it, what makes them tick, and what we can learn from them. Today I'm talking to Dr. Vibin Joseph. Vibin is the co-founder, executive director, and chief executive officer at BiOZEEN, a company that's revolutionizing vaccine production and reducing the cost of vaccine manufacturing around the world. He's a tech entrepreneur, business model enthusiast, and talent facilitator, with a passion to make a better world through unleashing the potential of our times. He's an engineer with degrees from Imperial College London and a doctorate from Warwick University, United Kingdom. His research interest lies in the cross-functional domains of systems design, productivity, design psychology, and moderating influencers in the pharmaceutical industry. I spoke to Vibin in April 2022, and I was really excited to talk to him ever since I saw a talk by him where he described how he challenged the global vaccine monopoly by bringing open source methods and mindsets to this old industry. I thought the conversation went really well, despite the fact that the audio quality wasn't great and unfortunately couldn't be dramatically improved. It should be completely clear though. There are also a lot of technical terms like bioreactors and the components that make vaccines possible and cheaper. Try to bear with them or maybe occasionally Google. But it's just important to understand that the core of what Vibin is doing is bring sound science and create things in an open source way that can be componentized and adopted by multiple smaller competitors. So where in the past the vaccines could only be manufactured by very large corporations, now they have this tool and productions can really become much more competitive. We talk about reducing vaccine manufacturing costs and how he went about breaking the monopoly on vaccine production, training people to produce locally using these open source methods. We talk about his motivation, how he was inspired by Ayurveda and holistic principles and holistic approaches to medicine, and how he was taught these basic principles of service from his grandparents. We also talk about the history of vaccine production and its inefficiency, why vaccines aren't a very appealing business. We talk about bioreactors and how a more modular and adaptable approach, including self-cleaning modules, can really help make the process cheaper and more efficient. How to break into a tough industry and how experience can sometimes be a baggage and prevent you from seeing the obvious. How he said no to being acquired by venture capital firms and stayed true to his purpose, which was lowering the cost of vaccines. And we also finished by talking about his spiritual perspective on leading a team, managing people, creating value in the world, which was very interesting. A lot stayed with me from this conversation, like the fact that 6.6 million children die each year due to the cost of vaccines. And being able to make a big difference here is incredible. BiOZEEN is now a partner to 2 out of the 5 largest vaccine manufacturers and has led to a 12 to 35% cost reduction in vaccines around the world, which is just incredible. This conversation with Vibin is one of a dozen or so weekly conversations we have lined up for you with people who are trying to make our world better. These include thinkers, designers, makers, authors, entrepreneurs, and impact investors who are working to change our world for the better. So follow this podcast on your favorite podcast app or head over to remakepod.org to subscribe. And now let's jump right in with Dr. Vibin Joseph. All right. I'm sitting here across the screen from Dr. Vibin Joseph. Vibin, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
And so there's a lot going on in the news today and in the news just in general this time. I'd like to open with the question of how are you these days and what it's like to be you these days?
Yeah, I think it's good. I think it's interesting. It's challenged me with the COVID crisis, and luckily and thankfully we've got out of it. I'm hoping it doesn't show its bad dagger once again. I'm here in India right now, and I think we are through the wave of the COVID crisis is what I'm inclined to believe. From the perspective of work, we actually worked during the COVID lockdown. And COVID lockdowns, was not the best for most of society. It was good for a lot of people from the fact that you could be at home, but we were actually working. And it was also time when you could introspect, analyze, and try and take perspective into what your life is all about. Yeah, so all in all, we are okay. I'm hoping, I've got very bright, inclination for the future. And the reason for that is most of the people here in India have been immunized. I think 60 to 65% have been double vaccinated. About 1.8 billion doses of vaccines have been kind of given out. So that's from the background perspective. From a personal perspective, things were okay. I had a baby daughter during the COVID times last year. It was interesting from that side, from a personal perspective. So it was interesting from all different perspectives, I have to say.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel the same way. I mean, in some ways, it brought both the best and the worst in people. Yeah. So, and we talked to Christian Matspia, who's a consultant to large companies, but he's using tools of anthropology and philosophy. And so he said, this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to study human nature because there's any number of experiments that you could never do. But right now we're out in the open, in terms of social isolation, in terms of, the effects of various circumstances. And he said, I didn't want to waste a single day. I was just obsessed with collecting data and learning from this.
Absolutely. I mean, I have to agree to that. I've never seen the 3 weeks of lockdown that we had, which was exercised quite well and diligently by most people, and aeroplanes were not in the sky, they were all grounded. And you could see the tranquility, if I may say. You could see the Himalayas from hundreds of miles away, and the air was clean and clear, and you could hear the birds chirping. And it really took me, at least me personally, into a world which I've just read in storybooks and, and books and novels and pieces of history, really. It was, and I could see a lot of squirrels mushrooming all over. I mean, the pigeons were there, the crows were there, the eagles were there, everything together. So those are the positives to it. But from a negative side, a lot of people did struggle and suffer. And we got to be cognizant of that as well. Yeah.
It's true both ways. I remember last year walking in Central Park in New York, and just like birds wouldn't even move away. Like somehow we changed the relationship with the wild animals. Squirrels and birds are, out and about freely because they're used to the humans not being there. There's something that was very illuminating about that, like how quickly that happened. We think we're all powerful, but, if we don't go out of the house, if we all don't go out of the house for a couple of months, like the wild returns. So I have this opener, which our regular listeners already know quite well. But I'd like to ask you, what's something you learned in childhood or early in life that still drives you today and still with you today?
That's an interesting question, I have to say. I would say, it's a lot to do with your upbringing. It's a lot to do with the environment you lived, you grew up. And I would say, can you be a healing touch to people, right? And the healing touch can actually be, can you do something from your regular work profile which impacts a lot of people positively? That's one. It could also be at your own family. It could be with your friends. It could be the person. It could be the stranger that you meet. Can you put a smile on someone's face? It could be as simple as that. And that's something which has been ingrained into me from my, during my growing up years. And I've always been inspired by seeing people smile and be happy. If I use the word happy. And that used to make me a lot more enthusiastic, used to inspire me a lot more. And then I did kind of think that, if you can do something that will directly save people and save lives, that's even better. At the place that I was brought up in Kerala, very close community culture. And I've heard a lot of stories, I have to say, when, people used to share food and people were excited to, congratulate each other, talk through things which made them sad, and then take things forward. So I think that really took me into who I am today. I think it's going to travel along with me, that very innate nature in me to, can you make people happy? Can you put a smile in someone's face? So luckily and thankfully, I'm in a space now where I'm directly saving children and saving lives. And I think it's a lot of happiness for me, for sure. Yeah. And it also made me even more happier because in the COVID vaccines that is used to immunize a good number of people across the world, and including here in India, is made and processed through the hardware and software that we actually manufacture. And so that gives me a lot of happiness. It does make me happy. It does make my soul happy, to use the word, Yeah. So it does complete me.
And we're definitely going to dive deeper into that in a bit. I heard an interesting story of how you came to study biology. So I'd love to hear that story of what made you take that route.
Oh yeah, that's just very interesting and very perplexing to a lot of people as well. I was very introverted by nature, and I was always happy to be by myself. Wasn't too happy interacting with a lot of people, I have to say, all through my school years. And then I wanted to be a pilot initially. That's because you have the cool fact, you have the Top Gun movies, etc., etc., etc. And I thought I should be a pilot. Yeah. But then realized in the 7th grade that, you know what? I've got my glasses, so possibly no Air Forces in the world are ever going to take me. And then I actually thought biology seemed quite interesting because I had a fantastic biology teacher. And I found it very interesting. I really loved it. And then I was thinking maybe I should be a doctor, maybe a cardiologist, or maybe a nephrologist, or maybe even a psychiatrist. But then when I did ponder a little bit more deeper into the entire subject, I was thinking that I would obsess over a lot of things. And the more I learned about the topic, I did realize that people were just squirming on the surface. No one really knew how diseases could be really, completely solved or eradicated from a person's body. So I was also fortunate to have a lot of doctors within my family. A good proportion of them were people who practice allopathy, right? People who practice your normal, modern medicine. I also had a good proportion of other people who actually practiced Ayurveda, the alternative medicines, Chinese medicine, etc., etc. And when I did connect with both of them, I just realized that it was more like beating around the bushes what I did think, at that stage of my life. And I was thinking, if I have a person who's got a psychiatric problem or a cardiac problem, I could, as a cardiologist, I could possibly prescribe statins, all the normal anticoagulants, etc., etc. If it was, psychiatry, it's a lot of standard kits of medicine from a modern medicine perspective. An alternative medicine or /Ayurveda, Chinese medicine is a lot more getting deeply into a person, trying to understand the person a lot more. So two people can have a fever, but you still prescribe different sets of medicines altogether completely. And that seemed interesting to me. But also, I did think I wouldn't be in a position to create a positive impact on an individual that quickly. And that is when I was thinking that, biology is my love. I would love it. But can I really scale that up? And that's when I did think that I would get into engineering per se. So that's how the entire thing came about. And then I kind of got into process side. I got into mechanical engineering per se. I did learn biology after that. And then I did think, I should do something and connect the dots from the knowledge perspective, from my love for medicines, from my love for therapeutics, and combine my engineering skill to try and scale those productivity of all those medicines being manufactured.
So at some point, and I would love to hear that story, but you learned about the scale of the problem of people dying from totally preventable diseases.
Yeah.
So how did that come about? What is the scale and how did you learn about it?
Oh, it was a very casual conversation. If I remember correctly, it was in a cafeteria. And I did have this friend of mine, a good friend, who did say that, there are a lot of children born around in her country, in Africa. But a lot of children are not named until they're 5 years old. And I did ask her, so why is that? And she came from a completely non-science background. And she was saying a lot of people die from meningitis, a lot of people die from deep, pertussis, etc., all the different diseases that afflict childhood. And I was thinking, I was trying to understand a lot more about the culture. So it was culturally ingrained in that society to name children after 5 years of birth. And that was very strange to me because at least from society here, people name them, say, within, 2 months. 3 months is the legal limit, before which you have to name a person officially. And that was really shocking for me. And then I was pondering a little bit more deeper and trying to understand. And that's when you had a lot of institutions either ways already. A lot of people had the solution. A lot of people had the vaccines. But unfortunately, it was not, it was not kind of getting to the scale of manufacturing from a price point perspective. This was about, say, 15 years ago. But of course, we have become a lot more better now. We have become a lot more better in terms of scaling up, in terms of producing, in terms of the logistics. So there are several parts to this. One is what is in the laboratories, which is the vaccines made as, from a molecular perspective. Then you've got to scale that up into a commercial production. And once you've scaled that up, you also have the logistics. Can you freeze that? Can you have the cold chain maintained? It is a whole host of array of problems. And I was actually thinking that from my perspective, from my knowledge, possibly the best thing that I could do is to focus from a production perspective.
I want to take a step back for a moment. So I read the number 6.6 million children die every year due to essentially vaccines being too expensive. Is that about the current number?
It is about, I think it's about 4.8 to 5 million even today. Now, a lot of these vaccine preventable deaths are not accounted for because a lot of people that we are seeing who die are not people who kind of tend to come to the general preview of audit standards and accounting methodologies. So a lot of them, a substantial number of them are in Africa. A good number of them are across the world, I have to say. So there's the other issue of, societies who are quite hesitant to take vaccines, right? And that's also the other issue. So you've got the issue of production. That was the case about, say, 15 years ago to, say, 10 years ago in terms of the volumes of production at the right appropriate price. And that's when people like the Gates Foundation actually got in. So all these societies actually did thinking. But then what happened? So these are institutions who try to focus on the cold chain, but not from a production perspective. So I did look at it from a production perspective to try and ease the production a lot more efficiently and cost effectively. So the pharmaceutical companies can manufacture that a lot more at a lower price point, And then they do have the option to reduce the prices that they sell it with companies like, with institutions like the Gates Foundation, the Gavi, the WHO, who directly immunize children on the ground,
So let's analyze this chain for a little bit together, right? And I wanna be in your mind as you decide where to focus. But I think there are the pharmaceutical companies that create the vaccines, right? They patent some way of making it, right? And so those are the big brands that we might know, right? And then there are manufacturers, if I'm not mistaken, and then eventually there's the whatever health system that actually acquires it to give to people. So are these the three major players here?
They are. I think you've got it spot on, actually. Oh, okay. I mean, I'll try and rephrase this for you, right? So you've got the governmental mandates. So you do have governmental institutions, the laboratories that's owned by the government, who would look at different diseases, because a lot of these diseases which kind of get from from an endemic phase or a pandemic phase typically do need a bit of governmental support, in the first place, because it wouldn't make money otherwise. It wouldn't make money from a pharmaceutical company perspective. So the interest for a lot of pharmaceutical companies is to look for the ones that could eventually be the cash cows. So you're right. So you do have the governmental bodies who can have their laboratories who run it. You can have smaller venture capital funded companies, who are in phase 1 or phase 2 clinical trials. And then to scale that manufacturing up is when you have the big ones, the big multinational corporations who typically right now in the current context would buy these smaller companies who are in phase 1, phase 2 clinical trials and commercially produce it at much larger scales. We're discussing the production now. But once that's produced, the bigger companies would always be focused on, giving directly to the consumers, right? Be it the developed markets, etc., where there's a lot more of lifestyle diseases. So the disease affliction, the burdens of disease is quite different, across the board. So if you look at the developing world, it would be a lot more from a preventable disease status, right? But if you do look at the developed world, it's a lot more of lifestyle diseases, if I may use that word, So it's a lot more chronic by nature, which actually means there is a lot more of medicine that has to be consumed in life, in a particular lifespan. But vaccines are typically once or twice or thrice or 4 times in a lifetime. Of course, COVID is changing that. We actually do not know. We do not have the complete data yet. But typically, vaccines are not to be used so frequently by people. It's just once, it's twice, it's thrice, or 4 times. I'm talking about one specific disease per se. An exception could be the flu vaccine, right? Where you take 2 shots every year. So from a revenue generation perspective, what makes sense a lot more is to focus on the lifestyle diseases which can eventually become repetitive in terms of consumption by the consumers or the patients. But from a vaccine perspective, it is there. It is made by the big companies for sure. But what the developing world needs, and that's the substantial amount of the global population, they would require these vaccines much more efficiently. So you've got 2 problems here. There's not a lot of money getting in, because of which vaccines are not being produced as efficiently and as effective. There's not so much of research happening there. Because you have that, the governments of these countries really can't procure it because it's too expensive for them. So that's when these global institutions have actually come in to act and serve as procurement agencies and to supply it to the WHO.
I'm curious, why did it make sense to target the manufacturers and lowering their costs of manufacturing at the time? Why did that seem like the right point of intervention?
Okay. The other important thing is vaccines and vaccine manufacturing was a monopoly. Or, it's not so much of a monopoly today, but it was a monopoly back then. And the reason for that is the issue is about the initial investment cost, which is extremely substantial, right? These are substantial, and that creates a barrier to entry for other people. So when you do not have a barrier to entry, you have a monopoly or an oligopoly at best, it means that people can command their margins at whatever price that they really want to do. So one of the thoughts that I was thinking was, if you reduce the price barrier from an investment perspective, the hardware perspective, the software perspective, that is when I was thinking that, that can bring in a lot more people into the game. And when you have more people in the play, it's going to create competition amongst themselves. And that's going to reduce the price of these vaccines. And I also did think that from an ethical perspective, I did think it was not appropriate to profit from someone's misery. The other issue is, hardly any countries in Africa were making vaccines or have the ability to make vaccines. And I was thinking, if you have an aeroplane model, right? So an aeroplane is expensive. So you are spending millions of dollars on buying an aeroplane. But if you do not train the pilots, it's never going to get off the ground. And what I was thinking was, these infrastructure requirements are steep, it's heavy, it's a lot more expensive than buying an aeroplane for sure. It's millions and millions of dollars. But then we've got to train the people as well who are producing the vaccines. So I wanted to approach it in two ways. One, get those equipments ready. That's more user-friendly. It had open source approach to and a transparent approach. And yet at the same time also train users in the pharmaceutical companies who are going to be using them. And this became a beautiful model for countries, especially Africa, right? Especially in Africa, where there had to be a steep upskilling of the workforce.
Yeah. So tell me more about this open source approach. So what is it that you go about doing? Because you're trying to change the way this is done, which makes it currently really hard and expensive to start manufacturing vaccines. What's the first thing that you go about creating?
Yeah, so I think one of the reason today is, for the higher prices is because it's not open knowledge per se, right? It is not open knowledge from a personal perspective. I don't think knowledge should be monetized, is what I would say. So it's like software. Can you have the software from a Windows perspective or from an Apple perspective? And if you do have that, it's going to have a lot more people get into the picture. It's going to reduce the cost automatically. And that's the same approach that's actually being followed from an apps ecosystem. So everyone can actually make the apps themselves. So here, what we have done is the equipment automation, right? The equipment's talking to each other. I've connected it. I did not keep it proprietary to our equipments only, but I kept it completely open source. So if you've got a third-party equipment, we can engage with that. And we can actually allow that to be, allow these equipments to speak to each other and get the final part. And that's a substantial portion. Because you got to remember that, all the capital equipments today, all the capital equipment providers today, a good chunk of them actually make their revenues from a recurring basis from services, which is largely automation programming related. And what we have said is that once we give an equipment or the hardware and software, the entire source code is going to be given to the customer. I've got no limitations in that. That's the first thing. And the second thing is that we would make it open so that, it can acquire data from other equipments. It can talk to other equipments. And more importantly, it can also have things like artificial intelligence and everything built in. So that's a thought process. If I were to super simplify it, the intention to monetize, which is so rampant within the service side of things, is something that I want to do away with completely. Because I've always been of the opinion that, if your services are to be monetized, it probably doesn't speak well on your hardware side of things. That's been my thought process. And also from a model perspective of BiOZEEN, the revenue model of BiOZEEN is to look for avenues which will result in price reduction or cost reduction to the pharmaceutical companies. So that is where BiOZEEN makes the money, right? So you would reach theoretically from an extremely low level, it would technically become zero. But then that's the time for you to move on to greener pastures. So by that very nature of how we are in, it means that you're automatically pushed into innovation. So it's not about leveraging and capitalizing, making money over something that you've sold. So typically what used to happen, which sometimes happens even today from our competitors' perspective, is every single change, they actually monetize it. Every single connectivity, they monetize it. Every single expansion, they monetize it. So that's not something which is great from our perspective. So that's not in our model.
Yeah, it's a very common conflict of interest, also in the software industry in general, where you sell a product and then you treat supporting that product as a profit center. So you have the interest of making the product hard to use, create more support issues, create dependence, because that's how you really make a big part of your money. And so it makes sense to me that you wanted to cut that off. That's a conflict of interest with the manufacturer and with the end client and with the end consumer.
And I have to say, it actually is not. It actually is not. It allows you to think further. It allows you to actually see what are the avenues. So what are the other avenues in which you can alleviate the pain points for the customer, right? So as long as, I'm pretty sure, as long as medicines are being manufactured, there is going to be a lot of pain points for sure. Our focus now is like the initial vision that we've had. Can you make vaccines like food? Right? Can every country of consumption produce vaccines within their shores, right? Within their own country. So today, it's very few countries in the world who make vaccines. There's very few countries. I mean, India is a huge producer. The US, Europe, hardly any other country. So all these countries are dependent on a few countries to serve the vaccine requirement. So is it fair that all the food in the world is produced by a few sources? So to me, that's a bit strange. And the consumption of vaccines, I believe, will increase. It should increase, because the world has to be safe. You will have a lot more of pathogens coming into the picture, because if you've got rapid urbanization that we're talking about now, a lot of these pathogens that was insulated from the normal world for millions of years are just going to come up, like the coronavirus now, like the COVID-19 now, right? So you would have this coming a lot more frequently, and vaccines are probably the way to go.
You're listening to Remake, a podcast about design, systems, and society. If you're listening on a podcast app, you already know how to follow podcasts. So please follow this one. If you're listening in a browser, just go to remakepod.org to find links to all the major podcast players where you can follow our show. So tell me about your bioreactors and how that plays into the picture, right? Because you made changes to the bioreactors as well as part of this new approach.
Yeah. So basically, one of the things about bioreactors is it is quite expensive, right? It's quite intensive in terms of investments. And what we have actually done is we have tried to make it as adaptable as possible to different platforms of vaccines, right? So if you look at vaccines, really, if I were to give you an example, we've got several platforms, right? You've got inactivated vaccines. You've got the adenovirus-based platform, which is a vector-based vaccines. You've got the mRNA vaccines, a lot of different kinds of vaccines, per se. And you've also got vaccine differences, say like tetanus, diphtheria, for instance. I'm just giving an example. So tetanus is anaerobic, so it doesn't require oxygen to grow. Pertussis and diphtheria is aerobic, right? So it's different characteristics within the pathogens by itself. Now, the objective of a fermenter or a bioreactor is to actually produce this at scale. And that's where the bioreactors and the fermenters get into the picture. And remember that these pathogens are lives, right? They are life. And you got to love them. You got to nourish them for them to grow. Now, what you have to remember is that you have to, after every batch, right, you got to clean it. You got to clean those systems completely. And what we have done is we've completely automated those processes, right? So if you have a batch, it automatically cleans up. So you've got inbuilt CIP stations within the bioreacting fermenters that we manufacture. That's the first thing. So what we have done, we have tried to do away with a lot of other auxiliary equipment and try to put that within these same equipment that you have. That's the first thing that we've done. And the second thing is we made it universally adaptable. So if you have a tetanus vaccine or a diphtheria or pertussis, whatever vaccines, because these are huge investments, what we have tried to do is, can you make small modifications, right? Like changing the chassis of a car.
So it sounds like it's built in this modular way where you can build it.
Spot on.
You put it together in different ways, right? So
absolutely. So it's modular. We've actually been working with another company as well to build modular plants now. So that conceptual thought process of the bioreacting fermenter, this was about a decade ago, right? So we have moved on from there onto modular plants, right? So you can have plants come up so quick. Hopefully, within a span of a year, we can have a complete, vaccine plant. So typically, it takes 4 to 5 years for a plant to be manufactured from a greenfield facility perspective. Earlier, before we got into the picture, you had these holders, which was specially designed for one particular make of equipment or components or consumables. What we've done is we've made it universal. We've said, we don't want to make money on that. I mean, we have to make money for sure, but then the money that we make should be fair. I think that's important. And we discuss with the customer, okay, these are our margins, and we're going to do this because that's important from our sustainability perspective. But we've been completely transparent from our pricing mechanisms, from a pricing perspective, because the focus for us is not to inflate prices and then sell. That's not what we do.
So at this point, you've partnered with 2 out of the top 5 vaccine manufacturers, and you've been able to reduce costs between 12 and 35%. Those are the latest numbers. So first of all, please correct me if I got these wrong. But then I'd love to hear how you overcame skepticism, because you come in, you're a young guy, you're still a young guy, you're still a lot younger than me. So you come in, without a massive brand. What was that process like to gain acceptance and to overcome the skepticism?
Yeah, beautiful question. So the first part of your question, absolutely right. On an average, about 30 to 35, 40% is what we have succeeded, literally shaved off. So you're right. You're completely right on that. So I've leveraged the lower price points within India, try to marry that with the technological advantages in the West, because we also have an office in Switzerland now, and trying to marry the two. And then finally, the person who's got to benefit is the end customer. So you're right in that first part. On the second part, you're absolutely right. It wasn't easy at all. I think one of the issues about this industry is that what is respected the most is, do you have gray hair? That's one. Or are you bald? That's two. So are you, reasonably old enough to have the amount of experience that is required to manufacture certain things, from an expertise perspective? But I do keep asking this to a lot of people that I know, that, I've always seen experience as a baggage, right? It doesn't allow you to explore further. It doesn't actually tell you what is required. It really scuttles ingenuity. Now, saying all that is good, but it wouldn't buy confidence. It was, the initial days were tough. It wasn't easy. It was a little bit daring, but it was also because a lot of people did see this as a young boy. I could actually see it from multiple perspectives. One, people are just simply amazed. Okay, I would like to talk. Yeah. And, I didn't have an issue about nagging people, trying to say, okay, could you please help me? I want to try and make this. I want to try and do this. I would flash my educational credentials and people would say, okay, wait a minute. Let me see what you're talking about. And a lot of people did give me a year, initially. And they would say, okay, let me see what's happening. But we are comfortable. That's okay. And I would talk a little bit more like how we are talking now and try and understand the pain points that they actually have. And I would say it's more from a learning perspective. I want to learn and possibly use the energy of my youth to try and see how we can elevate it. So when people actually see this, they think, okay, I see where you're coming from. There's a bit of a connectivity that is forming, because a lot of these people would have their own kids as well, who are possibly about my age back then, and they would say, okay, but there are a lot, and they would come to me with a lot of problems. So a lot of people were gradually increasing the amount of time that they would spend with me, at least from a talking conversation perspective. But then what happened is, then comes the next issue, right? How do you convince them? How do you really convince them? And then I used to say, okay, I had to chalk out, how is the decision-making process actually working? Now, who are the people who decide what needs to be purchased? Because a lot of people that I was interacting with initially were users. So that was a treasure trove of information, for sure. I could get that back in, and these users were happy with that, right? So it was more of a pyramid approach. And they would put me to their senior managers or their management representatives in their respective companies. But it still wouldn't solve the problem, right? And I used to completely empathize with them, because it is true, right? And why should a company really work with you and potentially risk a lot of the vaccines that are being manufactured? I did see that, and I did share this, and I did tell a couple of them that if I were in their position, I would probably not buy it, for sure. And that is when one gentleman of one pharmaceutical company said, okay, yeah, so you're right. You've listened to me. You've heard you've internally clocked into my thought process. You're in sync with it. Why should I take the risk? And then he asked me, what would you do then? And I told him, if I give it to you free of cost and you pay me once the performance is guaranteed and you see the performance, I think that should do the trick for you, wouldn't it? Is what I said. And that is when he shook my hands and he said, I think he was quite stunned with that confidence, is what I would think. But I do know that confidence, it's also probably the aging factor, right? So, you probably, I was a lot younger back then, and I thought, yeah, it really doesn't matter. I mean, I don't have anything to lose. So let me see what I can do. It's either make it or break it. And I'm happy with that, right? But that really opened up a Pandora's box. And that very company did place a lot more of, source a lot more of hardware and software from us. But with that spark of confidence, they were willing to experiment. They were willing to grow with us. And news did spread fast. A lot more of companies did come across. A lot more people were interested. And even today, I have to tell you, I don't have a single marketing person. No, I have one marketing person on the ground. That is it. We do not market. I've always believed in the thought process that it should be the word of mouth that spreads your brand. So it was more like a ripple effect, right? It was a chain effect. And we did not intend to market. We did not intend to be a public-facing thing. I would be happy being in the back, in the background, out of the picture, but supporting a lot more of people in the world, create a lot of goodness to people around. Even today, I've had a lot of, not today in the literal sense, but even these days, I've had a lot of companies who said they want to align with us, who want to take over, acquire us. I've had a very persuading interactions with some of the biggest multinational corporations, and they've said, I think together we can actually do a lot of things. I've had, venture capitalists who've actually queued, put in money, and I've actually said, no, that's not something which I would like to do, because my goal for BiOZEEN is different. My vision for BiOZEEN is different. That when we're 60 or when we're 65, when we look back and when we think that, we've done so many good things for a lot of people, we do not need any recognitions for that. But when our minds actually tell us, when our conscience tells us that, yes, we've been instrumental in creating this generation of people, that's going to make us happy. No big multinational corporation or venture capital firm is going to allow me to leave those revenue streams, because in their head, the picture, that temporal time span is about 5 years, maybe 4 years, 5 years, and in 5 years you cannot even make a plant. A vaccine plant takes about 5 years. So if you have investors coming over and saying, oh, you know what, they want to make a lot, they want to make a quick buck at it, it's not something which I would engage in, because it's going to kill the soul of my company. It's going to kill the soul of my organization. I did have a fantastic offer, which would probably, make me a lot of money, but that's not what I want to do. I think if you're happy, if you're contented, you should be okay.
So one thing, and thank you for that. One thing that, that you clearly have and it's striking is this very clear mission, a very clear sense of meaning in your life. And it seems to have come at a fairly young age. It's like you wanted to do good, and then you found a way to do good, and you kind of locked into it. And then you're telling the story of how you win these pharmaceutical companies over with just confidence. And so where is this coming from? What can you tell us about purpose? First of all, what does it feel like to wake up every day and have such a clear purpose? And then, how would you recommend other people go about finding their own?
So, I would answer this with the statement, I do not know what my purpose really is. Neither would I want to know my purpose is. So I do not know what my purpose is. Neither would I want to know what my purpose really is. The pursuit of purpose could be the wrong starting point, but the pursuit of the end result could be the right starting point. And this, again, it's from my background, I have to say. From my maternal side, they were a lot more spiritually inclined. And my paternal side, I had a lot of doctors within the family. And there was this huge intellectual interaction that I did have as a child even. And those interactions were quite interesting for me. I've had conversations with my family who actually say that the greatest happiness that they have is the fact that they could allow for the sustenance of someone else's family. And that was so true. Because, if you kind of get to the nature of giving, it probably makes you a lot more happier than making. So, if the giving is a lot more important than making, and those thoughts actually did capture my imagination, and these conversations that I've actually had, and these childhood stories that I've listened to, I've had even my mother and my father actually talk about that. And I used to ask them these questions, okay? So who made us? Who really made us? And they used to say, well, I think it's God who created us. But I also had this propensity to attribute a cause-effect relationship within my mind, right? And I used to think, it doesn't make sense. So who created God then? Is what I used to ask myself. And as I grew up, as I made sense of the world, I did realize that nothing in the world is black and white. Nothing in the world is clear. Everything's ambiguous. And as years went by, those thoughts were crystallizing in me, right? So I kind of looked at, a mobile phone that we all have. And so I've had the greatest people, scientists in the world who talk about natural evolution, and all these things. And I used to be inclined to believe in them. And I still do believe in them without any doubts. And I say evolution is a process flow. Now, who started that process flow, right? How was it collective intelligence of a system inbuilt into what you have? Someone has to make it. And I used to think, if you have a mobile phone, it's made of oil, it's made of sand. And people ask me how. And I say, your plastic comes from oil, your semiconductor chips come from silicon, and that's sand. You put oil and sand together for 1 million years, you subject it to pressure, temperature, heat, whatever you want to do, it's still not going to be a mobile phone. It needs a creator, and that is you. So if you have a mobile phone that has got the ability to multiply by itself, and if you ask that mobile phone, it's not going to remember that it's you, the human, who put the process flow for it to actually grow and multiply. So in the same way, the beauty about this is that there is something called a temporal darkness. Do people actually know how the pyramids were made even today? You don't have a reason for that. Those angles, those absolute north positions were so perfect that nothing in the world today can also do that even now. So think about million years before, when you had none of these big jumbo cranes or anything. You had people working to make that happen. But how did that happen? So that means there is something called a temporal knowledge darkness across civilizations. And that actually means to me there is a creator, is what I would say. But the creator was so smart that the process flow was such that you live your life, is what I would be inclined to believe. You just live your life in the way that you want to. You've been empowered by the creator to actually decide in the way that you want to live. And this becomes a lot more apparent to me because I run an organization. And I say, I don't want to micromanage you. I've started something called self-managing teams. So at BiOZEEN, we have a presence in 21 countries across the world. And we have a bunch of people, 300 odd people who actually sit in Bangalore and who do a lot of control. And I don't micromanage or look at every single installation. That's not what I do. And I've told people, I trust you, I believe you, and I know you're intelligent, you're smart, and you can do what you want to do. And that's a self-managing team concept that I've implemented. So they go onto a site, they are on their own. Now, this creator would have probably made it in the same way. And I'm seeing that, right? I'm actually seeing that. And that's one of the reasons I actually say, when you ask me about the purpose, and that's one of the reasons I hesitate to tell people what my purpose is. But, my purpose can be putting a smile on someone's face, allowing people to know what their purpose really is. But when they do ask me, what should my purpose be? I say, let there be no purpose. Just allow things to flow.
So I have one final question for you. It's the question we ask at the end every time. So in his TED Talk, the philosopher Alain de Botton talks about the difference between a lecture and a sermon. A lecture being, a little bit of an informational thing that's common in the modern world, where the person makes their own mind about what they want to do with it. And a sermon being an urgent plea to change someone's life. And so you've given us multiple sermons already, I feel like, but if you could give a short sermon for one thing that could really change the quality of life for people or change life for the better for people, what would it be?
I would say be the healing touch to everybody. Be the healing touch to the people around you, to your own family, to your community, to nature, because nature also has life. It probably doesn't breathe in the same way that we do breathe. It doesn't talk in the same way that we do talk, but probably it has a collective intelligence that all of us share. So I think we all have to be considerate. We all have to be humble enough, have the ability to say, it's not I at all times. Can you give up certain things? Because you got to know that life is finite. You've come into this world, you have to go. There's no question about that, right? There's no question about that. So I think it's about be considerate, try and be a healing touch to anything and everything around you. It could even be animate and inanimate, everything. Can you show grace everywhere? Can you show mercy everywhere?
Thank you, Vibin. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Remake is produced by myself and Regina Rothstein. Research and editing by Louis Brady. And audio engineering by Greg Cocoveos. If you enjoyed the podcast, please consider writing a 5-star review in Apple's podcast or wherever you're listening. It helps many more people discover the podcast and also just makes us feel good. Current support for the podcast comes from my own design company, Remake Labs. We're a global strategic design sprint agency aimed at improving outcomes through repeated and rapid design interventions. Now, until next time, Be well, everyone, and see you next week on Remake.